This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is May 12th, 2022, and this is episode 289.
I'm Stuart Lunderbaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, possibly the worst political debate ever in Canadian politics history. It may have just occurred. We'll get into the latest Conservative Party leadership debate. We'll also round up some of the other stuff that's happening, the Alberta Court of Appeal targeting the federal environmental impact assessment laws, fundraising in the BC Liberal Leadership Contest, Horgan becoming the ambassador to Ireland. Everything is happening. Actually, it was kind of a quiet week. That's okay. I was busy watching parliamentary debates in Ottawa from the Bloc on abolishing the prayer and then being horribly disappointed when the Liberals, Conservatives, and Charlie Angus teamed up to keep it. So,
Not just that last one.
Yeah, 4 NDP MPs support the prayer in the Parliament. Angus, as well as Daniel Blakey, Rachel Blaney, and Laurie Idloat, the new MP for Nunavut, who I wouldn't have guessed. Otherwise, yeah, it was the Bloc, NDP, and Greens. The Independent, who we all forget about because he got kicked out of the Liberals for being a possible predator, he also voted with the government. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. That's all just my work and Bloc shenanigans. We have lots of Canadian and BC politics to talk about. Before we get into that, 289, we're 11 episodes away, 11 weeks away from our 300th episode. July 28th, potentially. Assuming we keep on schedule, which we've been pretty good at over the last...
We've pretty much, with the exception of a couple weeks, kind of in that Christmas New Year period every now and then, we've consistently hit a weekly schedule, so I am pretty confident that we'll hit 300 on that day.
So listeners, let us know, Twitter, Slack, email, what you think we should do. I think you can leave a comment still on our website at politicos.ca if you want. We sometimes get those and we sometimes read them. What should we do for episode 300? Maybe COVID will be low enough we could do something live. Who knows? If you want to be the first to know or get our ear the easiest, go to patreon.com/politicos, become a patron, become a supporter of the show. We'll add you to the Slack channel and you can get into all of the conversations about BC politics, Canada politics, municipal politics, and the Canby Report crew are there too, or just lots of memes, humor, and everything else is going on there all the time. It's great. Let's talk about sad trombones. Scott, you suffered through the first official Conservative leadership debate. The one we talked about last week was just the unofficial one organized by the Canada Strong and Free Network, I believe.
I think so. I always just call them the Manning Center because I can never remember which collection of vaguely superfluous adjectives and nouns are their new name. But yeah, that was the unofficial debate and a very shouty debate, which, for all of how terrible this other one was, they at least avoided repeating that particular failing.
So once again, I followed along via the reactions after the takes on Twitter and in our Slack and elsewhere, and I feel less inclined to go back and watch this one. It doesn't seem like anyone learned anything substantive about the candidates. Patrick Brown was there, to his credit.
Yes, he was, and yeah, he had a decent debate performance. But you weren't interested to know which of the candidates' favorite artist is Amy Winehouse?
I saw the questions as they were being asked via Twitter. Things like, what book are you reading right now? What's your favorite music? Who would you go back in history and have dinner with? Was that an actual question?
That was an actual question. The here's a list of things you can ask if you're really bad at small talk and need something to get a conversation going. Like they pulled that from there.
The format was like a celebrity dating show thing, right?
A little bit, yeah. And what if they had asked kind of one question on a get to know the candidates thing? Fine, it's no big deal. The problem is they spent like a fourth of the debate on that particular thing in a way that just got to be excessive.
I think the party doesn't want to talk about policy.
I just do not care what Leslie Lewis has been binging on Netflix. That was an actual question.
Pierre Poilievre's latest read was Jordan Peterson's 12 Simple Rules, or that he was watching the Trotsky documentary. That is fascinating in its own way.
Probably not actually true. I would bet a fairly significant amount of money those were picked for their political salience more than their representation of reality. The Trotsky ones may be specific enough that's the case, but the Jordan Peterson one felt really, I'm going to say something that's going to appeal to the crowd.
Yeah, unless he's the guy who's going back and reading that repeatedly, which I could see. I'm assuming he bought it fairly shortly after it came out and read it then, which was like a couple years ago now. I'm not going to look this up.
It was pre-pandemic. That's all I can remember.
The before times. But that's not the only way it was in a game show format, as I understand. There was also a literal trombone.
Yeah, I don't even know how to explain this to people who didn't watch it. Basically, the moderator had a button that would play the classic sad trombone sound.
Jesse, I dare you to find the audio and clip it in here. Go for it.
That should absolutely be done because it was literally the most stereotypical classic version of that. There are probably millions of copies of that sound file on the internet. Anyway, he had the button to make the trombone sound, and during opening statements, he laid out a couple of rules that candidates couldn't mention other candidates or the prime minister, and if they did, they would be cut off
by name.
Sad trombone sound.
Like they could allude to
Not
them?
by name.
Is this like a parliamentary debate, like you have to say the member for such and such, or they just should not even be...
They could obliquely refer to them, but not directly. I think saying the prime minister was over the line. Some reference to another candidate who has whatever position I think was okay. I can't remember those details too much because it was a whole thing. Anyway, that was, quite the way to start. And, for all the silliness that it was when a sad trombone sound played, and it is kind of silly that, okay, you can't talk about the prime minister, the singularly most important politician in the country in a political debate, is a little silly. On the other hand, the Conservative Party desperately needs to learn how to talk to normal people without ranting about Trudeau all the time. And on that front, it was probably a net win, despite the ridiculousness of it.
It's like training wheels for their leadership contendants to be like...
A little bit, yes.
We know you want to go all over the place, but you need to be able to stay within the line. Here are the bumpers on your bowling alley. Wow.
The opening statements were actually probably some of the better things I've heard those candidates say, in part because I think they were having to work hard to avoid the easy lines on that. They did actually also talk about some issues, but part of the problem was the format was so terrible because they dedicated 20 minutes to the speed dating portion of the debate that the candidates only really had 15 seconds to answer questions. So you would get stuff like, what is your position on Ukraine? You have 15 seconds. Specifically, I think it was about no-fly zones, which everyone except Patrick Brown was firmly opposed to, and Patrick Brown was kind of a throw the caution to the wind, fuck it, let's go, we're gonna start shooting down Russian planes, which is A, certainly a take, and B, the whole question felt weirdly dated because the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying and doing fairly well. The Russians don't actually have air superiority, and the big threat is from artillery, which a no-fly zone isn't going to do much for.
It would be wild for Canada to come out. Yeah, it would be wild for Canada to come out now, like months after Zelensky asked our parliament for a no-fly zone directly and specifically, to be like, yeah, now we're ready. Now we'll do it. Now we'll engage in a direct shooting war with Russia, just in the sky, not on the ground. It's Patrick Brown's foreign policy is distinct from his party's. Can we say this, right? The most notable thing about his public campaign is his only interview was in one ethnic press, I think. I forget where it was, but it wasn't a mainstream or major news outlet.
If this is the thing I think you're referring to, it wasn't even an interview. It was a case of, I think it was an event he was at where the question got recorded and later reported out.
Where he said, he wouldn't stand with the Conservatives' policy of moving the Canadian embassy to Jerusalem.
I was saying the Tamil Tiger thing, but...
Oh, no. There was a interview he did, I think it was actually an interview, where he said he wouldn't move the Canadian embassy to Jerusalem, despite that being a relatively long-standing Conservative policy. He would welcome Palestinians as refugees to Canada. I think when asked, that was in response to a question. That wasn't him fronting it, but he took a much different approach to Palestinian-Israeli issues than the Conservatives have been taking for quite a while. Which, I'm not against. I'd be interested in seeing a lot more come from him, but it's just,
Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, it was a publication. The interview was with Sada al-Mashrek, a publication that serves the Muslim community in Montreal. Brown's team says the transcript published was an inaccurate portrayal of his views after he was asked about it for the National Post and in response to criticism from groups like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs that called his comments disturbing. Let's come back to the debate, though. One of the other things I noticed in the third hand I was watching it through was just the repeated, oh yeah, Scott Aitchison is also here kind of takes. How was the moderation? Because that doesn't strike me as great.
The moderation was terrible. The moderator clearly liked to talk more than he liked to listen to the candidates, and had a bad tendency to try and become the show. Part of it too also has to do with the weird format. They would go down the line and ask everyone. Occasionally the moderator had to be reminded by one of the candidates that he'd missed them when going through that, which also not super great. But yeah, later on, they had this weird paddle system where two candidates would get to go one-on-one, and then other candidates could basically raise their paddle that got handed out, because apparently the debate needed prop comedy in it as well, to get a chance to interject or say a piece on it, and they only had 5 each, and will probably not surprise anyone, as Pierre Poilievre shot through his very quickly and then had to stand quietly while everyone else debated.
There's a joke I won't make there.
But yeah, on the opposite side, Scott Aitchison was pretty reserved about using his, so it became a case where there was a fairly long stretch there where you didn't hear much from him in that. Yeah. That said, the moderator was fairly good at stopping just interjections and cutting candidates off if they went outside their time or talked over each other too much, which is an improvement over the last one for sure.
Well, and I guess the other takeaway I took from following the feedback was and some of the coverage after, was there were sharper criticisms, particularly from Charest and Brown against Poilievre and Poilievre against Charest, with
those two really ripped into Poilievre for his Bitcoin views.
It's really easy these days.
That it is. The Brown's line was fake internet money.
There's the lie.
Yeah, there's not a huge amount wrong with that.
All money is kind of fake, but at least it has the backing of governments to give it some tangibleness.
Yeah, so the value of cryptocurrencies has fallen by a massive amount since Pierre Poilievre really started campaigning on those, which, left a pretty big opening, particularly because this big shtick is that they're a thing that people should have access to because of inflation, and if you do the implied inflation rate of what Bitcoin or Ethereum would be, it would massively outstrip what the Canadian dollar is doing on that. Also, he wants to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, which is probably the thing that everybody took away from this debate as kind of the big...
I think he had announced that a day or two in advance and started talking about it then. It doesn't really matter. It definitely blew up with the debate because pretty much everyone else was criticizing him for it, from like columnists to the Prime Minister to former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge, who said that's bullshit in terms of what he thinks of Poilievre's ideas about interfering in the Bank of Canada's independence.
It's fairly rare for anyone who's been through the Bank of Canada, whether they're current or former governors, to get that feisty with a political candidate. The idea that the Bank of Canada is supposed to be independent of the government typically means they take that very seriously and don't weigh in on this stuff. And it really says something about how aggressive Pierre Poilievre has been, that they felt the need to, or someone, David Dodge, felt the need to weigh in on this and push back.
On the other side, I gather Poilievre had a string of long criticism for Charest around raising taxes, being a spender, having
long gun registry,
all those kind of things. So one that I found particularly interesting that you can confirm for me is he criticized Charest for voting in favor of a bill to criminalize abortion when he was part of Mulroney's government. That bill died in the Senate, which is why we don't have an abortion law now. But given that...
Yeah, so that did come up. That was part of the exchange on abortion. It got asked. The 5 non-Leslyn Lewis candidates all took some version of, we're not going to touch this at all. Lewis was, I'm pro-life, but I'm not going to do a huge amount on changing the laws on it. Pierre had some very vague, I'm not going to introduce any bills or something on that. Like the standard line from conservatives of, we will not introduce any legislation, any government legislation on this, etc., etc. His response was noticeably more couched than that. And
Poilievre is a religious Christian, and I can't remember if he's evangelical or Catholic, but has been rated as like a pro-life candidate in the past by Campaign Life Coalition and some of those groups. His rating has fallen from those groups, which is generally a good thing in my view, as I think he moderated to try to get more to the leadership position. So rather than being a full religious conservative, he's more toward like the Stephen Harper position, where he's still a religious person, but is wanting to win.
Yeah.
Hence the confusion in his position.
Yeah, Charest picked up on that and went after him pretty hard on, we're never going to win if that's how your positions are. That's going to be alienating to the... Oh, no, it wasn't that. It was that the people of Canada will need an answer, etc., etc. on that. And that is where, as a rejoinder to Charest's attack on Poilievre for abortion, he hit back in 89 or whenever. No, it was later.
88 was the decision, so it would have been 88, 89 is when the bill...
Yeah, but I thought the law took a little while. It was basically in the very final days of the government before the election. Like, didn't the Senate kick it back and it died on the order paper when an election was called or something?
Yeah, but they had 1 year to bring it in. I guess they didn't have to. They could have brought it in whenever.
Anyway, sometime roughly around the period I was born, plus or minus a year, like a long time ago, on that is when Charest, as part of the government of the day, did vote for the Supreme Court said the previous law wasn't good, so we're going to adjust and put in some sort of legal framework for abortion. I don't actually know the details of the bill that came after.
I don't either. I don't actually know how it was viewed.
Yeah. Like, it was not a, we're going back to no abortions in the country. There was...
To be clear, before Morgentaler, we had therapeutic abortion committees where men at hospitals could decide whether or not you would get an abortion, and that created a lot of inequities. So abortion was allowed in some cases.
Yeah,
but
anyway, Chevrolet voted for the bill on that, and that got criticized by Polyev on that. It feels fairly weak as a thing. Not only was it 30-something years ago, but people in government cabinets vote with their government on this stuff. It's just kind of how it is.
Yeah, the only exception I can think of in that era was, I think it was Grace McCarthy and Kim Campbell in Bill Vander Zam's cabinet, who staunchly opposed the way he was going to try to continue to restrict abortions in BC following the overturning of the law. And basically Vander Zam's government was already falling apart at that point, and so he didn't really have much of a leg to stand on to maintain his fundamentalism. But that was a unique situation. Generally, cabinet is pretty united around key legislative priorities. Back to the debate once more. Any other takeaways? I heard that Roman Baber hates communism.
That is true. He did come off as more nuanced than you would have guessed on issues around criminal punishments, rehabilitation, that sort of thing. Some of the drug law stuff. So, he seems to be one of those people that takes the freedom stuff very seriously and actually to its logical conclusions, which is not always the case.
Right, the sort of consistent libertarian where I might disagree with some of the axioms you run by, but at least they all flow.
Yeah.
I guess it doesn't make sense to ask if there's a winner from a debate like that. I think the winners are people like me who didn't watch it.
Yeah, I think Brown came off looking reasonably well, and he wasn't tarnished by the clown show that was the previous debate. And in that case, the clown show was all on the candidates rather than being mostly on the format and the moderator in this case.
It's so
he seemed
ridiculous,
fine.
right?
Pardon?
This entire situation is so ridiculous, right? Because this is potentially the one opportunity for English language conservatives to meet the candidates, the one main opportunity that the party has provided. The other debate is going to be in French, which makes sense. We're a bilingual country, and the Conservatives need to pick up seats in Quebec if they want to become government as well. But if we don't get another English language debate...
Also, not everyone on that stage is particularly fluent in French.
It's going to be a mess.
I think Lewis is... Pardon?
It's going to be a mess as well.
Yeah, so you're basically going to have
Jean
Charest and Polyev going at each other with as much intensity as before in the previous ones. And then you're going to have the rest of them with French that sounds the way Brad Pitt's Italian in Inglourious Bastards was.
Or
and
Stephen Harper's French in his first election.
Yeah, it is going to be terrible. They're all going to be standing there awkwardly trying to figure out how to say the basic stuff in French. It's going to be a mess. It's not going to really tell people much. The one bright side is for whatever reason, French moderators seem to just do better jobs in Canada, and the French debates are always better moderated and more informative.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the difference in the culture, but there is something about the Quebec political culture is a bit more rough and tumble and willing to question politicians on a regular basis. So from that aspect, it'll probably be a better debate, even if it's less rounded by all the candidates, but it's what it is.
Yeah, so get back to who won, or who at least came out looking fine. Polyev, what you're going to get. I think Baber comes off as less unreasonable than his social media and email blasts and all that stuff come across when you see him in person, but I can't figure out who his base is in this, because you have Lewis and Polyev taken the same lane, and both of them are more well-known and able to win, in theory, have paths to victory. So I don't know. He's probably going to be the first one off the ballot once they start eliminating people. Aitchison was fine. He said his piece, did the "why can't we all get along? We need to appeal to people who aren't obsessive about this stuff and swing voters, and there will be people that appeals to, myself being one of them, but there's no memorable moment of the night from him, which is probably what would be needed to catapult him out of what I'm going to guess is second to last. We don't really have any polling, but that's pretty much where I figure he would be. All the rest were kind of just what you'd figure. No terrible moments or great ones, just there.
A debate where everyone was just there. Just what we really hope for in our democracy. Maybe we'll leave it there and move on to our roundup of quick takes. First up, Justin Trudeau took a trip to Ukraine. He made a few announcements while in Kyiv and then came back after the weekend, just your weekend in Eastern Europe in a war zone.
Although these days the fighting's pretty far from Kyiv. Yeah, it was noteworthy when Boris Johnson went like a month ago there. Now it feels weirdly routine. And when I was putting together the episode plan document, I actually forgot that it happened this week, which probably says roughly how impactful it is. There was starting to be I don't think it really in the press, but definitely kind of rumblings out there that, man, everyone else has done the state visit. Where's Trudeau on this? And he went pretty much, I think, as late as he could go without it starting to become a thing about why hasn't he gone. But none of the announcements were all that exciting. There's additional $50 million in military assistance for stuff like cameras for drones and the like, which will be useful. The Ukrainians have been making some very effective use of drones for a bunch of different military applications. So good there. There's $10 million going towards human rights and civil society groups and demining efforts. Also good. But in terms of the political impact, this feels fairly
Yeah, like you said, I think everyone's largely forgotten about it. It does allow him to not have the criticism of why haven't you gone? And he was able to pound, like in the debates I was watching, it allowed the Liberals to go, people don't care about prayer and legislature, they care about the war in Ukraine, they care about inflation. Why are we debating this? I'm like, it's the Bloc's day. They can make it a debate about whatever they want. The Bloc pointed out the Conservatives had a day, used their opposition day once in recent memory to debate whether we should have a national oil day. Like,
oh god, the Conservative Party's a meme sometimes.
I do not recommend watching debates. While we're talking about the Liberals, they are slowly working towards bringing forward an online hate law. This will be legislation that they've long promised, but after receiving a torrent of critical feedback just prior to the snap election call, they've gone back to the drawing board and sent it to kind of a weird framework, an expert advisory group that's not really governed in the same way committees are. And so they're just holding discussion sessions where the experts kind of go over things. They might take some consultations. They're not publishing the consultations they receive, but people like Michael Geist have FOI'd them and gotten them out, which is not how our committees are supposed to work when they study things. But now the panel is being highlighted in the news as some of their preliminary reports, which are as far as I can tell, the summaries of the workshops they're doing. So not like official recommendations, but statements like the panel believes this, or the panel had disagreement about this. It's like, it's notes from discussions without any names on them. And the big thing from the legislative framework workshop they have is that the hate law should be fairly broad and cover large and small online platforms, not just Twitter and Facebook. So crowdfunding apps, everything from Airbnb to video games to our Slack channel.
Yeah, so one of the things that was included here and got picked up in the CTV story, and that's where I came across this, because a lot of people in my Twitter feed were expressing outrage at the prospect that it would include private online conversations as well as the things you post on Twitter and Facebook, which I think rightly has a lot of people concerned. And yeah, would in theory absolutely include our Slack, all Slacks in general, but ours too. And potentially, reading that, the DMs in our Slack or Signal DMs or WhatsApp messages and the like, which that feels pretty offside in terms of how far the government should go on really this public communication. Public social media is one thing, but private conversations between people really feels outside the bounds of what should be acceptable in a free and open society for a government to be regulating.
Yeah, I started this topic by kind of highlighting what this report is, because it's not a formal recommendation yet, so it's not clear how serious this is. It was a serious enough part of discussion that it made it into the notes of the meeting, and some parts of this are more broadly accepted among the experts. But it notes in the CTV piece, for example, that some experts say, quote, it would be hard to assert generalized obligations to act responsibly on some platforms like social media companies, but not others who operate on the same level of the tech stack. So the idea being, some of them do point out that it would be really hard to regulate Signal DMs without breaking the whole point of Signal and its encryption. But
which is definitely a risk where the government could go. There have been other countries that have moved to block encryption, and in a way that I don't think really is compatible with civil liberties, but I believe the Brits have gone in that direction, and every now and then you get ideas floating up in the States about that too.
Yeah, I know the BCCLA is keeping a close eye on this. And trying to figure out what's going on. Michael Geist, there are a lot of people keeping a close eye on this, so that's not to say I'm optimistic about what comes out of it, but people will be sounding the alarm if it's bad.
Yeah, and it could definitely be bad. Part of the problem with the Liberals is they tend to feel so self-righteous in their motivations for stuff and so self-confident that they often feel immune from criticism on that, or that they shouldn't be criticized because their motivations are pure, and they can bring in some pretty bad ideas because they're not really thinking them through, because our intentions are good and whatnot. And this in particular feels like one of those areas where that's a particularly high risk factor for. But it's worth keeping in mind that if whatever the final proposal is, it will probably pass, because the Liberals have a good chunk of votes, and they probably get the NDP to sign on to an online harms bill unless it's truly egregious.
It's not part of the confidence and supply agreement, to be
It's not part
fair.
of that.
I don't totally disagree, but I think if the NDP will be willing to bring forward civil liberties concerns, and has in the past.
Yeah.
Does they'll shoot it down? I don't know.
Yeah. It's hard to say. But keep in mind, if this thing passes, in theory, in a couple of years, it won't be Justin Trudeau that will be making these decisions. Hey, it'll probably be a third, some appointed body, but the people being appointed to that will be appointed by Pierre Poilievre or Jean Charest.
Or Jagmeet Singh.
Oh, let's not get ridiculous. The NDP are never going to win power in our lifetimes federally, but I would just caution the Liberals on this, that if you're not willing to have Stephen Harper or Pierre Poilievre making the decisions on what's good or not online, you shouldn't be putting those powers into the federal government's purview.
Speaking of powers in the federal government's purview, the Alberta Court of Appeal thinks there are too many in that purview. Specifically, the court has ruled on a reference question filed by the United Conservative Party's government on whether the Impact Assessment Act, this was amended as Bill C-69 a couple years ago, and the Conservatives in Alberta and the Prairies were up in arms, and the federal Conservatives as well. The court was asked, is this bill that expands in some ways the ability of the federal government to look at major resource development projects within the scope of the division of powers of the Constitution? The court came back with a majority, a 3-1-1 decision. So there was a majority, a concurring, and a dissenting decision. So it was a 4-1 decision that, yes, it is unconstitutional. This is, quote, a classic example of legislative creep. And that's it. It's a reference question, so it doesn't strike the law down. Kenny seems to think it does. And he's like, the Impact Assessment Act no longer applies to Alberta. You can argue that, but it doesn't repeal the law. You still would have to bring another challenge.
It becomes easier once you have this reference on the books.
But yeah, it's an interesting decision. I don't think either of us have had time to really dig into it. A number of lawyers and commentators on Twitter, especially environmental lawyers, are pretty cynical about this, and they think it's unlikely to survive a Supreme Court of Canada appeal, who have generally taken a slightly broader approach to federal powers and the scope of federal powers, especially around the environment. The Alberta Court of Appeal was like the lone dissenter compared to Saskatchewan and Ontario in finding that the federal carbon tax was unconstitutional. So, I don't know, something's going on in this court. Maybe they just have a slightly different approach to the law, or maybe this time they did get it right, but we'll have to see where this fight goes. It's one of those showy promises from the Jason Kenney government that it's a good way to spend money.
I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't strike me as entirely unreasonable that you could have cases where, some degree of federal legislative power makes sense. It's going to be okay. When it's expanding out kind of within the delegated federal powers and kind of using that to basically do an end run around the division of powers and ultimately regulate resource stuff, that doesn't strike me as an inherently unreasonable concern or something that could, on balance, go too far legally. I just don't know enough on the specific details of this one to say where that line is or isn't.
Well, and if it goes through the Supreme Court of Canada, maybe we'll come back and visit it in much more depth then. Next, let's talk briefly about some BC politics. The Elections BC has released some of the Liberal Party leadership contestant financing reports. They would have released them all, but 4 candidates out of 7 didn't file anything yet. Stan Sipos, past guest of the pod, did not file as he had extenuating circumstances, so he has until June 6th to file. Kevin Falcon, Val Litwin, and Renee Merrifield all also must file by June 6th, but they're facing a $500 fine for not doing it. Kevin Falcon is notably being sworn into the legislature this week, so presumably he didn't want anything to throw off that news cycle, so maybe he's just eating the fine.
Assuming there's something bad in there he wants to hide.
Or it just is news he doesn't want to talk about as much.
I don't know, people like us will skim through the reports and pick out something noteworthy, but it's, for the most part, most people aren't looking through and talking about there. The only way I'm gonna eat a fine on this to avoid filing is if there's something he really doesn't want to talk about. If it's just some donor that he is not, I don't even know on that one.
It would list his major donors.
Yeah, unless there's someone that's particularly embarrassing to be on that list that he doesn't want. He just honestly seems like very small potatoes to do an end round around this. So,
although $500 isn't that much, but
$500 isn't that much. But
let's talk about the people who did file. So we have data from Michael Lee, Ellis Ross, and Gavin Dew. Michael Lee raised about $621,000, Ellis Ross just over $500,000, and Gavin Dew about $80,000. what's interesting here is Ellis Ross outperformed Michael Lee.
In terms of number of donors, but not total whole.
Oh, no, sorry, in votes.
Oh, yeah.
So Ellis Ross went to the last round and had 34% of the vote. Michael Lee had 14% of the vote. On the first round, Ross had 26% and Lee had 10%. So Ross did much more with slightly less money. Now, the campaigns all had a cap of $600,000, so there was no reason for Ellis Ross to go raising more money.
That's still 100,000. That's 1/6 the amount that he missed the spending cap by. So it's not nothing. That said, like the Ross campaign, looking at it from the outside, definitely seemed to be a kind of very lean and focused operation where they weren't splashing around a lot of money on stuff.
Yeah,
And
they definitely had the most donors, so they were getting a lot of small donors, 1,650 almost, versus Michael Lee had about 850, and both had similar number of large donors. So Lee got a lot of money from a smaller number of people versus Ross had a bit more of that grassroots feel. Now, it was nowhere near enough to win, but that was how it appeared, at least from the outside, that Ross was picking up some of the momentum, especially once Aaron Gunn pulled out or was rejected. He was rejected. That's right. And then, Gavin Dew got 5% of the vote and raised $80,000 from 441 people. Can't say much about that when we don't have kind of the people in the same realm, Val Litwin and Renee Merrifield, to compare them to. I want the rest of the data.
So we'll just have to wait for after June 6th for the rest of them and see where it goes. But someone else we're waiting to see where they go is the Premier. There's been a rumor circulating around for a while now about whether he's going to run for a third term. And this past week, he did an interview with CTV News where he talked a bit about that. So he's not ruling out a third term run. Nevertheless, there were a couple interesting quotes about how he has to, quote, "I have to confess my energy's been flagging." I think that was
fair enough. He did just
the guy said
cancer and COVID.
Yeah, and I can't speak to cancer, but COVID definitely knocks quite a bit of energy out of you while you're down with it. Like, fair enough, but still, like, at the same time, typically politicians who are planning on sticking around do their absolute best to try and avoid the appearance of having flagging energy. So it is interesting. Could just be a moment of more honesty than intentional, or it could be a sign of where things are going.
Yeah, he told CTV on coming out of cancer treatment that, quote, "I think I was driven by adrenaline when I came out of it. I was just so happy to be finished with it. I probably jumped into the pool a little bit earlier than I should have." As in, he did seem overly, back in it when he stepped back into the role and Farnworth stepped out of the kind of acting premier role. But Horgan says on the future, as long as I can keep making a valuable difference, I'm going to keep doing it. And I think he cited, as long as people like me, I'll keep doing it. But then the even more interesting part of this, or random part of this interview, is that they asked him about speculation that he might be the Canadian ambassador to Ireland one day, as he has dual citizenship and seems to really enjoy referencing Ireland. And he said, "I think I could probably pull that off. It's not a bad idea. Next time I talk to the Prime Minister, I'll see what he has to say about that." What?
It's such an out of left field idea. Was anyone actually talking about this before?
I don't know. I'd missed it, but I miss a lot of things, but good for him. I'm sure it'd be fun. I like Ireland. It's a nice country, but you have a job right now. One would hope you're entirely focused on that. And maybe the text of the transcript doesn't capture the tone. Maybe he was being a little more satirical or funny about this. Or maybe he's like, cool, I'll go to Dublin. We'll have to see. He's got the power that he doesn't need to actually decide anything. He can pretty much play coy like this for as long as he wants. Internally, he does at some point need to tell his party, but again, he's the boss. He just needs to make sure he gives the rest of the party enough time to get someone in before the next election, if he needs to. Or win the next election and then bugger off shortly after that. Or, I don't know, stick around as long as you want, as long as you're popular. What do I know?
And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Thanks for listening.